David Rodriguez never imagined that doing his job well would almost destroy his life. For 15 years, he had worked quietly in a small office building in Virginia, analyzing financial documents for the government. His security clearance gave him access to information that most people would never see. But David wasn't the type to brag about his work. He came to the office every morning at 7:30, drank his coffee black, and spent his days looking through endless spreadsheets and financial reports. His job was to follow the money. When government agencies spent taxpayer dollars, someone had to make sure everything was legitimate. David was that someone. He had a sharp eye for details that others might miss, and over the years, he had caught several cases of fraud and waste. Nothing too dramatic, usually just companies charging a bit too much for basic supplies or padding their hours, the kind of stuff that happens when people think nobody is watching. But this case was different. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when David received a thick folder marked with red tape. Inside were financial records from Phoenix Defense Corporation, one of the biggest military contractors in the country. They had been awarded a massive contract to provide communication equipment to military bases overseas. The numbers were huge, bigger than anything David had seen before. Phoenix Defense had been around for decades. They had contracts all over the world and employed thousands of people. On paper, everything looked normal. The invoices were properly formatted, the dates matched up, and all the required signatures were in place. But something felt off to David. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but after 15 years of doing this work, he had learned to trust his instincts. He started digging deeper. The first thing he noticed was the timing. Phoenix Defense was billing for work completed months before they had even received the necessary permits. It was like claiming you finished building a house before you had permission to break ground. Then he found the shipping records. According to the paperwork, they had delivered thousands of communication devices to a military base in Afghanistan. But when David cross-referenced the delivery dates with the base's records, he discovered something shocking. The base had been abandoned 6 months before the supposed delivery. David felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just a mistake or sloppy bookkeeping. Someone was deliberately falsifying records to steal millions of dollars from the government. He spent the next 3 weeks going through every document with a magnifying glass. The more he looked, the worse it got. Phoenix Defense wasn't just overcharging for equipment they had delivered late. They were billing for equipment that didn't exist, work that was never done, and deliveries to places that had been shut down for months. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 2 years, Phoenix Defense had stolen nearly $50 million through fake invoices and phantom deliveries. But the most disturbing part wasn't the money itself. It was where some of that money was going. David found bank records showing large payments from Phoenix Defense to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. These weren't business expenses or legitimate payments to suppliers. The money was being funneled through a complex network of shell companies, each designed to hide the true destination of the funds. Following the paper trail was like solving a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. David would trace a payment to one company, only to discover it was owned by another company, which was owned by yet another company. Each layer made the money harder to track and the people behind it harder to identify. What worried David most was the sophistication of the scheme. This wasn't the work of a few rogue employees padding their expense accounts. This was organized, systematic fraud that required knowledge of government contracting procedures, international banking laws, and military procurement processes. Someone with serious connections had to be involved. David knew he had to report his findings, but he also knew he had to be careful. Phoenix Defense had friends in high places. Their executives regularly appeared at Washington charity events, and their lobbying budget was enormous. They had contracts with multiple government agencies and employed former military officers and retired politicians. He decided to document everything meticulously before making his report. David photocopied every suspicious document, created detailed spreadsheets tracking the fraudulent payments, and mapped out the network of shell companies. He worked late into the night, often staying at the office until 9 or 10 o'clock to avoid drawing attention to his investigation. His wife, Patricia, started to worry about him. She noticed he was bringing work home and seemed distracted during dinner. When she asked about it, David gave vague answers about a complicated case. He couldn't tell her the details because of his security clearance, but he also didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. After 6 weeks of investigation, David had compiled a report that was over 200 pages long. It detailed every fraudulent transaction, every fake invoice, and every suspicious payment he had found. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Phoenix Defense had been systematically stealing from the government for years. David submitted his report through the proper channels, following all the protocols he had been trained to use. He sent copies to his immediate supervisor, the Inspector General's office, and the Defense Contract Audit Agency. According to regulations, these agencies would now conduct their own investigations and, if necessary, refer the case to law enforcement. He expected the process to take several months. Government investigations always moved slowly, especially when they involved major defense contractors. David figured he would eventually be called to testify before a congressional committee or provide additional documentation to prosecutors. What he didn't expect was that some of the very people who were supposed to investigate Phoenix Defense had been receiving money from the company for years. 3 members of the Congressional Defense Committee had received substantial campaign contributions from Phoenix Defense executives. A deputy secretary at the Pentagon owned stock in the company through his wife's investment account. Even David's own supervisor had a brother who worked as a lobbyist for Phoenix Defense. David had unknowingly stumbled into a conspiracy that reached much higher than he had imagined. His detailed report, which he thought would expose fraud and protect taxpayers, had actually painted a target on his back. The people he was trying to help were the same people who had been profiting from the scheme he had uncovered. In the weeks that followed his report, David noticed small changes around the office. Colleagues who used to chat with him during coffee breaks suddenly seemed busy whenever he approached. His supervisor, who had always been friendly, started giving him routine assignments that kept him away from sensitive financial reviews. David didn't realize it yet, but powerful people were already planning their response to his investigation. They couldn't make the evidence disappear, but they could make David disappear, or at least they could make sure nobody would believe anything he said ever again. The plan they hatched was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Instead of trying to discredit David's findings, they would discredit David himself. They would turn the hunter into the hunted, transforming the man who had exposed their crimes into a criminal himself. David continued going to work every day, unaware that his life was about to change forever. 6 months had passed since David submitted his report about Phoenix Defense Corporation. Life had returned to normal, or so he thought. He was back to reviewing routine contracts and spending his evenings at home with Patricia and their teenage daughter, Lisa. The family had even planned a vacation to visit Patricia's parents in Colorado for the upcoming holidays. David was in his kitchen making breakfast on a cold December morning when he heard car doors slamming outside. Through the window, he could see 3 black SUVs parked in his driveway. His first thought was that something had happened to one of his neighbors. Then he heard the heavy footsteps on his front porch. The doorbell rang once, followed immediately by loud knocking. David opened the door to find 6 federal agents in dark suits standing on his porch. The lead agent, a tall woman with short gray hair, held up a badge and spoke in a crisp, professional tone. "David Rodriguez, I'm Agent Wilson with the FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest." David felt like the world had suddenly tilted sideways. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No mistake, sir. You're under arrest for espionage, theft of classified materials, and conspiracy to provide national defense information to foreign agents." The words hit David like a physical blow. Espionage? Foreign agents? He struggled to process what he was hearing as Agent Wilson continued reading him his rights. Behind him, he could hear Patricia's sharp intake of breath and Lisa asking what was happening. "Can I at least see the warrant?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Agent Wilson handed him a document that was several pages long. As David scanned it, his hands began to shake. According to the warrant, he was accused of photographing classified documents and selling them to Chinese intelligence operatives. The alleged crimes had taken place over the past year, during the same time he had been investigating Phoenix Defense. "This is insane," David said. "I've never sold anything to anyone. I've worked for the government for 15 years. You can discuss that with your attorney," Agent Wilson replied. "Right now, we need you to come with us." As David was being handcuffed, he caught sight of his neighbors gathering on their front lawns. Mrs. Thompson from next door was holding her phone, probably recording everything. The Martinez family across the street was standing in their doorway, their children pressed behind them, staring with wide eyes. David's mind raced as he was led to one of the SUVs. How could this be happening? He had never done anything wrong. He had spent his entire career serving his country faithfully. The idea that he would betray that trust was not just false, it was impossible. During the drive to the federal courthouse, David tried to make sense of the charges. The warrant mentioned specific dates when he had allegedly photographed classified documents. But David remembered those dates clearly. On 2 of them, he had been attending a security conference in Baltimore as part of his job. On another date, he had been homesick with the flu. The warrant also mentioned encrypted communications with foreign operatives and suspicious financial transactions. David had no idea what they were talking about. He used encrypted communications as part of his job, but only for legitimate government business. And the only unusual financial transaction he could think of was the $5,000 he had inherited from his aunt's estate 6 months ago. At the courthouse, David was processed like any other criminal. His fingerprints were taken, his photo was snapped, and he was placed in a holding cell with other arrestees. The reality of his situation began to sink in as he sat on the hard metal bench, still wearing the jeans and sweater he had put on that morning to make breakfast. A few hours later, David was brought before a federal magistrate for his arraignment. The prosecutor, a young man in an expensive suit, painted a picture of David as a greedy government insider who had sold his country's secrets for money. He described a sophisticated espionage operation involving dead drops, encrypted communications, and payments to offshore accounts. The defendant used his security clearance to access highly classified materials, the prosecutor said. He then photographed these documents and passed them to Chinese intelligence operatives through a network of intermediaries. In exchange, he received payments totaling over $100,000. David's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Robert Chen, seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. During their brief meeting before the hearing, he had advised David to remain silent and not discuss the charges with anyone. The magistrate set David's bail at $2 million, an amount that might as well have been $2 billion for a government employee with a mortgage and a daughter heading to college. David would remain in federal custody until his trial. The news media picked up the story within hours. By evening, David's arrest was featured on every major news network. The headlines were devastating. Government analyst charged with espionage. CIA spy sold secrets to China. Trusted insider betrays America. The television reports showed footage of David being led away in handcuffs, his face frozen in shock and confusion. Reporters described him as a trusted government insider who had betrayed his oath and sold America's secrets to the highest bidder. None of the reports mentioned his 15 years of faithful service or his recent investigation into defense contractor fraud. David's colleagues watched the news coverage with disbelief. Some remembered him as a quiet, dedicated worker who always followed the rules, but others began to recall moments that now seemed suspicious in hindsight. Hadn't he been working late a lot recently? Didn't he seem nervous and distracted during the past few months? Patricia was devastated. She had to take time off work to deal with the media attention and the legal proceedings. Reporters camped outside their house trying to get interviews with family members and neighbors. Lisa was pulled out of school after classmates began taunting her about her father being a traitor. The family's savings were quickly exhausted by legal fees. Patricia had to hire a private attorney to replace the overworked public defender, but even the initial consultation cost more than they could afford. She was forced to take out a second mortgage on their house and borrow money from her parents. Meanwhile, David sat in his federal holding cell, trying to understand how his life had been turned upside down so completely. He replayed the past year in his mind, searching for any explanation for the charges against him. He thought about his investigation into Phoenix Defense and wondered if there could be a connection. The evidence against David seemed overwhelming at first glance. The prosecution had bank records showing large deposits into his accounts, photographs of him meeting with individuals they claimed were foreign operatives, and computer records showing that classified files had been accessed from his workstation. But David knew something was wrong with every piece of evidence. The bank deposits they were talking about were legitimate payments. his aunt's inheritance, a tax refund, and his annual bonus. The meetings with foreign operatives were actually conferences and training sessions he had attended as part of his job. And while classified files had been accessed from his workstation, that was exactly what his job required him to do. Someone had taken normal, everyday activities and twisted them into evidence of espionage. The question was who and why. David began to suspect that his investigation into Phoenix Defense had made someone very angry. Angry enough to destroy his life rather than face exposure for their crimes. But proving that connection would require resources and expertise that David didn't have. As he lay on his narrow cot that first night in federal custody, David realized that he was fighting for more than just his freedom. He was fighting for his reputation, his family's future, and his daughter's ability to hold her head up in public. The people who had framed him had not just taken away his liberty, they had tried to take away everything that mattered to him. But David had one advantage that his enemies had overlooked. His security clearance, the very thing that had made him valuable as a scapegoat, would also be the key to proving his innocence. The same system that had given him access to classified information had also been monitoring him constantly for signs of disloyalty or foreign influence. David didn't know it yet, but his salvation lay in the very security procedures that his accusers were trying to use against him. 3 weeks after David's arrest, Patricia sat in the waiting room of a downtown law office, clutching a folder full of documents. She had spent every waking hour since David's arrest trying to find someone who could help him. The public defender assigned to the case was handling 30 other cases and barely had time to return her phone calls. Patricia had interviewed 6 different attorneys before meeting Rebecca Torres. Unlike the others, Rebecca didn't seem intimidated by the espionage charges or the government's apparent mountain of evidence. She was a former federal prosecutor who had switched to defense work 5 years earlier, and she specialized in cases involving national security and government employees. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Rebecca said as she entered the waiting room, "I've reviewed the basic facts of your husband's case. Before we proceed, I need to be completely honest with you about what we're facing." They sat in Rebecca's office as she spread out copies of the government's evidence. The prosecution had photographs of David meeting with 3 different individuals they claimed were Chinese intelligence operatives. They had bank records showing unexplained deposits totaling over $100,000. Most damaging of all, they had computer logs showing that someone using David's credentials had accessed and downloaded classified files related to military communication systems. On the surface, "This looks terrible," Rebecca admitted. "But I've been doing this for 20 years and something about this case doesn't feel right." Patricia leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "The evidence is too clean, too perfect. Real espionage cases are messy. People make mistakes, leave loose ends. This looks like someone constructed a case rather than uncovered one." Rebecca pointed to the photographs of David's alleged meetings with foreign operatives. "Look at these pictures. They're all taken from a distance and they're all in public places. If your husband was really selling secrets, why would he meet his contacts at a hotel conference room, a restaurant, and a security expo?" Patricia studied the photos. Even in the grainy surveillance images, she could see that David was wearing his work ID badge in 2 of them. "Those look like work events," she said. "Exactly. And look at the dates." Rebecca consulted her notes. The first meeting supposedly took place at the National Security Conference in Baltimore. The second was at a restaurant during the International Financial Crimes Symposium. The third was at the Defense Technology Expo in Arlington. "David attended all of those events for work," Patricia said. "He has certificates and conference materials from each one." Rebecca nodded. "That's what I thought." "And the people he supposedly met with?" "I ran background checks on all 3 of them. One is a professor of international relations at Georgetown University. Another is a financial analyst who works for an anti-money laundering consulting firm. The third is a retired Army colonel who now works in private security." Patricia felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. "So they're not Chinese spies?" "Not unless the Chinese intelligence service has gotten very creative with their cover stories," Rebecca said with a slight smile. "But here's what really caught my attention." She pulled out another document. The timing of this investigation. "According to the court filings, the FBI opened their investigation into your husband 6 months ago. That was just 2 weeks after he submitted his report about Phoenix Defense Corporation." Patricia remembered David working late on that report. He had been stressed and preoccupied for weeks, staying up late to document what he had found. "You think this is connected to his investigation?" "I think it's the only thing that makes sense," Rebecca said. "Someone with a lot of power wanted to destroy your husband's credibility before his investigation could do any damage." Rebecca explained her theory. David had uncovered a massive fraud scheme involving Phoenix Defense Corporation. But the conspiracy went deeper than just the company itself. Government officials, possibly including people in David's own agency, were involved in the cover-up. When your husband submitted his report, it landed on the desk of someone who had a vested interest in making sure it disappeared, Rebecca said. But they couldn't just bury the report without raising questions, so they decided to destroy the messenger instead. "By framing him for espionage," Patricia said, "the pieces starting to come together." "It's actually brilliant in a sick way," Rebecca continued. "Once someone is charged with espionage, anything they've reported becomes suspect. No one will take seriously the findings of a supposed traitor." Rebecca outlined her defense strategy. First, she would demand access to David's complete security clearance file, including all background investigations and polygraph results. Second, she would trace the source of the supposed evidence against David. Finally, she would investigate the financial connections between Phoenix Defense and government officials. "The key is David's security clearance," Rebecca explained. "To maintain his level of clearance, he undergoes extensive background checks every 5 years and polygraph examinations every 2 years. His most recent polygraph was just 3 months before his arrest." Patricia didn't understand the significance. "What does that mean?" "It means that 3 months ago, your husband was asked direct questions about whether he had any unauthorized contact with foreign nationals, whether he had ever provided classified information to unauthorized individuals, and whether he had any hidden financial problems or sources of income." Rebecca pulled out a thick manual about security clearance procedures. "These polygraph examinations are extremely thorough. They ask about everything from gambling debts to romantic relationships to political beliefs. If David was really working as a spy, the polygraph would have detected it. So the polygraph proves he's innocent? Not by itself, but it creates reasonable doubt. The government is essentially arguing that your husband passed one of the most thorough security screenings in the world, just months before becoming a foreign agent. That's a very hard sell to a jury." Rebecca also planned to examine the computer evidence more closely. According to the prosecution, someone using David's login credentials had accessed and downloaded classified files. But Rebecca suspected that if they looked hard enough, they would find that David was in meetings or at conferences during some of the times these downloads supposedly occurred. "The people who framed your husband made one crucial mistake," Rebecca said. "They assumed that because David worked with classified information every day, it would be easy to make it look like he was stealing it. But government computer systems keep detailed logs of everything. If we can show that David was physically somewhere else when these downloads happened, we can prove the evidence was fabricated." The financial evidence would be harder to challenge, but Rebecca had ideas about that too. She planned to trace every deposit in David's bank accounts back to its source. She suspected that some of the money the government claimed was payment for espionage was actually legitimate income that had been mischaracterized. "There's something else," Rebecca said, lowering her voice. "I've been asking around about this case, and I've heard some interesting rumors. Apparently, there's an ongoing investigation into Phoenix Defense Corporation by the Defense Contract Audit Agency. Your husband's report might have been the tip of the iceberg." Patricia felt a mix of hope and fear. "Does that help David?" "It could. If we can show that David was targeted because of his investigation, and that his investigation was accurate, it completely changes the narrative. Instead of a traitor selling secrets, David becomes a whistleblower who was framed for doing his job." Rebecca warned Patricia that the case would be difficult and expensive. They would need to hire computer forensics experts, private investigators, and possibly former intelligence officials as expert witnesses. The government had unlimited resources, and they would fight hard to protect their case. "There's something else you need to understand," Rebecca said gently. "Even if we prove David is innocent, the damage to his career and reputation may be permanent. Government security clearances are based on trust, and once that trust is questioned, it's very hard to rebuild." Patricia nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I just want my husband to come home." "We're going to fight this with everything we have," Rebecca promised, "and we're going to start by demanding access to David's security files." The government wants to use his clearance as evidence that he had access to classified information, but that same clearance is going to prove that he never would have betrayed his country. As Patricia left the law office that afternoon, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. For the first time since David's arrest, she believed that the truth might actually come out. But she also understood that they were up against powerful people who had already shown they were willing to destroy innocent lives to protect their secrets. The real battle was just beginning, and Patricia knew that her family's future hung in the balance. But now they had a plan, and more importantly, they had someone who believed in David's innocence and knew how to prove it. Rebecca Torres was about to take on the fight of her career, armed with nothing but the truth and David's own security clearance as weapons, against a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. The federal courthouse was packed on the morning of David's trial. News crews lined the sidewalk outside, and reporters pushed against the security barriers hoping to catch a glimpse of the accused spy. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension as potential jurors filed in for selection. Rebecca Torres sat at the defense table next to David, who looked thin and tired after 4 months in federal custody. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had watched his life crumble around him, but Rebecca could see a spark of determination in his eyes as she explained their strategy one final time. "Remember, David, we're not just fighting to prove your innocence," she whispered. "We're fighting to expose the people who did this to you." The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Peterson painted David as a greedy government insider who had systematically betrayed his country's trust. He promised to show the jury bank records, surveillance photos, and computer evidence that would prove David's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. "The defendant had access to our nation's most sensitive secrets," Peterson told the jury. "He swore an oath to protect those secrets, but instead he sold them to the highest bidder. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what treason looks like in the 21st century." Rebecca's opening statement took a completely different approach. Instead of defending David's actions, she attacked the entire premise of the prosecution's case. "David Rodriguez is not a spy," she told the jury. "He's a whistleblower who discovered a $50 million fraud scheme and was framed by the very people he was trying to expose. Over the next few days, you're going to see evidence that will shock you. You're going to learn that the real criminals in this case are not sitting at the defense table." The prosecution's case seemed airtight at first. They presented bank records showing large, unexplained deposits into David's accounts. They showed surveillance photos of David meeting with alleged foreign operatives. Most damaging of all, they presented computer logs showing that classified files had been accessed and downloaded using David's security credentials. But Rebecca was ready for each piece of evidence. When the prosecution presented the bank records, she countered with documentation showing that every deposit was legitimate. The largest amount was David's inheritance from his deceased aunt, complete with probate court records. Another deposit was his annual performance bonus from the government. A third was a tax refund that had been delayed due to a clerical error. The prosecution wants you to believe that these normal, everyday financial transactions are somehow evidence of espionage, Rebecca told the jury. But the only thing unusual about David's bank account is how carefully he documented every penny. When the prosecution showed the surveillance photos of David's meetings with supposed foreign agents, Rebecca was ready with a surprise. She had located the actual conference agendas and registration records for each event where the photos were taken. The prosecution claims these photos show secret meetings with foreign spies, Rebecca said, projecting the images onto a large screen for the jury. But look at what's really happening in these pictures. She enhanced the first photo, showing David sitting at a conference table with his work ID badge clearly visible. This is the National Security Conference in Baltimore. David was there as part of his job, attending sessions on financial crimes and money laundering. The second photo showed David in a restaurant with 2 other men. This is the International Financial Crime Symposium. David was having lunch with other conference attendees during a scheduled break. The third photo showed David at what appeared to be a trade show. This is the Defense Technology Expo in Arlington. David was there to learn about new software tools that could help him do his job better. Rebecca then called her first surprise witness, Dr. William Chang. the Georgetown professor whom the prosecution had identified as a Chinese intelligence operative. Dr. Chang took the stand, wearing a conservative suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He spoke with a slight accent but perfect English as he explained his background. He had been born in Taiwan, immigrated to the United States as a child and earned his Ph.D. in international relations from Harvard. He had been teaching at Georgetown for 15 years and had written 3 books on financial crimes and international security. I remember meeting Mr. Rodriguez at the conference in Baltimore, Dr. Chang testified. We discussed his research on defense contractor fraud. He seemed very knowledgeable and passionate about protecting taxpayer money. Did Mr. Rodriguez ever ask you for classified information? Rebecca asked. Absolutely not. Our conversation was entirely academic in nature. Did you ever pay Mr. Rodriguez any money? No, of course not. I'm a college professor, not a spy. The prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Chang was brutal but ineffective. They tried to suggest that his academic interest in financial crimes was somehow suspicious, but Dr. Chang calmly explained that studying financial crimes was his profession, not his hobby. Rebecca's second surprise witness was Colonel Michael Thompson, the retired Army officer whom the prosecution had also identified as a foreign operative. Colonel Thompson was a decorated veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before retiring to work in private security. I met Mr. Rodriguez at the Defense Technology Expo, Colonel Thompson testified. We talked about new technologies for detecting fraudulent financial transactions. As someone who had dealt with contractor fraud overseas, I was very interested in his work. But Rebecca's most devastating witness was someone the prosecution had never expected to testify. Agent Lisa Kim from the CIA's Office of Security. Agent Kim was responsible for conducting polygraph examinations of government employees with security clearances. She was a stern-looking woman in her 40s who had been doing this job for over 20 years. She had personally administered David's most recent polygraph examination. Agent Kim, Rebecca asked, when did you last examine Mr. Rodriguez? 3 months before his arrest, Agent Kim replied. And what was the result of that examination? Mr. Rodriguez passed without any signs of deception. Rebecca pulled out the polygraph report and had Agent Kim read the relevant questions aloud. Have you had any unauthorized contact with foreign nationals? Have you ever provided classified information to unauthorized individuals? Have you received any unexplained payments or gifts? Do you have any hidden financial problems? And Mr. Rodriguez answered no to all of these questions? Rebecca asked. That's correct. And the polygraph indicated that he was being truthful. The prosecution tried to argue that polygraph tests weren't admissible in court, but Rebecca wasn't offering the results as evidence of David's innocence. She was using them to show that the government's own security system had found no evidence of the crimes David was now charged with. The prosecution wants you to believe that 3 months after Mr. Rodriguez passed the most thorough security screening in the world, he suddenly became a foreign spy, Rebecca told the jury. Does that make sense to you? But Rebecca's biggest surprise came when she called her final witness, Thomas Mitchell, a forensic computer expert who had analyzed the government's digital evidence. Mitchell was a former FBI cybercrime specialist who now worked as a private consultant. He had spent weeks examining the computer logs that supposedly showed David downloading classified files. What did you find when you analyzed these logs? Rebecca asked. Several anomalies that suggest the logs were manipulated, Mitchell replied. Can you explain what you mean? Mitchell used a PowerPoint presentation to show the jury what he had discovered. The logs show that someone using Mr. Rodriguez's credentials downloaded large files at specific times. But when I cross-referenced those times with other data, I found inconsistencies. He pointed to one entry on the screen. This shows a download at 2:30 p.m. on October 15th, but Mr. Rodriguez's keycard data shows that he left the building at 1:45 p.m. that day to attend a doctor's appointment. Another entry showed a download at 11:20 p.m. on a Friday night. But Mr. Rodriguez's phone records show that he was at his daughter's school play at that time. I have photos from the event showing him in the audience. In your professional opinion, Rebecca asked, were these logs authentic? No. Someone with administrative access to the computer system created fake entries to make it appear that Mr. Rodriguez had downloaded these files. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the Implications of Mitchell's testimony sank in. If the computer evidence was fabricated, then the entire case against David was built on lies. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She had one more revelation that would change everything. Mr. Mitchell, in the course of your investigation, did you discover who had administrative access to these computer systems? Yes, I found that someone with high-level security clearance had been making unauthorized changes to the logs for several months. Were you able to identify this person? Mitchell nodded gravely. The digital fingerprints led back to someone in Mr. Rodriguez's own office. Someone who had both the access and the motive to frame him. Rebecca paused for dramatic effect before asking her final question. Who was it? David Rodriguez's supervisor, Deputy Director Franklin Webb. The revelation that Deputy Director Franklin Webb had manipulated the computer evidence sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Judge Catherine Martinez called for an immediate recess as federal marshals began searching for Webb, who had mysteriously failed to appear for his scheduled testimony that morning. Rebecca Torres knew she had delivered a devastating blow to the prosecution's case, but she also knew that Webb's disappearance could be seen as convenient timing rather than proof of guilt. She needed to connect all the dots for the jury in a way that left no room for doubt. When court resumed after lunch, Rebecca called her final witness, Patricia Rodriguez, David's wife. Patricia had never wanted to testify, but Rebecca convinced her that her husband's life depended on her willingness to tell their story. Patricia walked to the witness stand wearing a simple black dress, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. The courtroom was completely silent as she began to speak. My husband is not a spy, she said, her voice clear despite her nervousness. He's the most honest, patriotic person I've ever known. He believes in this country and everything it stands for. Rebecca guided Patricia through David's career, his dedication to his work, and his investigation into Phoenix Defense Corporation. Patricia described how David had worked late every night for weeks, documenting the fraud he had discovered. He was excited about his findings, Patricia testified. He felt like he was protecting taxpayers from being stolen from. He never imagined that doing his job would destroy our lives. But Patricia's most powerful testimony came when she described the aftermath of David's arrest. She told the jury about losing their savings to legal fees, about their daughter being taunted at school, about the media camping outside their house. They didn't just arrest my husband, Patricia said, tears flowing down her cheeks. They destroyed our entire family. And for what? Because he found out that powerful people were stealing from the government? The prosecution's cross-examination of Patricia was brief and ineffective. Assistant U.S. Attorney Peterson tried to suggest that she might not have known about her husband's secret activities, but Patricia's genuine emotion and detailed knowledge of David's work made her completely credible. As Patricia left the witness stand, Rebecca could see that several jurors were wiping their eyes. She had accomplished what she set out to do, humanize David and show the jury that he was a victim, not a criminal. But the biggest drama was yet to come. Just as Rebecca was preparing her closing argument, federal agents entered the courtroom and whispered something to Judge Martinez. The judge called both attorneys to the bench for a hushed conference. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Judge Martinez announced when the attorneys returned to their seats, I've just been informed that there have been significant developments in this case. We're going to recess for the day while these matters are resolved. Outside the courtroom, Rebecca learned what had happened. Franklin Webb had been arrested at Dulles International Airport, trying to board a flight to Switzerland with a false passport and over $2 million in cash. When federal agents searched his house, they found evidence of his connections to Phoenix Defense Corporation, including bank records showing payments disguised as consulting fees. But the most damaging evidence was found on Webb's personal computer. Detailed files showing how he had manipulated the evidence against David. Webb had saved draft versions of the fake computer logs, along with notes about how to make David's normal work activities look suspicious. Even more shocking was what investigators found when they dug deeper into Webb's finances. He had been receiving payments from Phoenix Defense for 3 years, long before David's investigation began. Webb wasn't just covering up the fraud. He had been part of it from the beginning. The next morning, Judge Martinez made an unprecedented announcement. With Webb's arrest and the discovery of evidence proving David's innocence, the prosecution was dropping all charges. Mr. Rodriguez, Judge Martinez said, looking directly at David, "You are free to go. On behalf of the court system, I apologize for what you and your family have endured." David stood on shaky legs, hardly believing what he was hearing. After 8 months in federal custody, he was finally going home. Patricia rushed to embrace him as the courtroom erupted in applause. But the story was far from over. Within hours of the charges being dropped, federal investigators had arrested 3 Phoenix defense executives and 2 other government officials who had been part of the conspiracy. The investigation that David had started with his original report was now a full-scale federal probe involving multiple agencies. Rebecca held a press conference outside the courthouse, with David and Patricia standing beside her. The same reporters who had crucified David 8 months earlier were now calling him a hero. David Rodriguez is a patriot who was nearly destroyed for doing his job. Rebecca told the assembled media. He uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, and instead of being praised for his service, he was framed for treason. David finally spoke publicly for the first time since his arrest. His voice was hoarse with emotion as he addressed the cameras. "I just want to say that I never lost faith in the system, even when the system seemed to have lost faith in me," he said. "The truth always comes out eventually, and I'm grateful that mine came out in time." The aftermath of David's exoneration was swift and dramatic. Phoenix Defense Corporation's stock price collapsed as the full extent of their fraud was revealed. Congressional hearings were announced to investigate how such a massive conspiracy could have operated for so long without detection. Franklin Webb eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided detailed information about how the scheme worked and who else was involved. His testimony led to additional arrests and the recovery of over $30 million in stolen taxpayer money. David was not only cleared of all charges but was formally commended by his agency for his investigative work. He was offered his old job back with a promotion and a substantial raise. More importantly, his security clearance was fully restored, and all records of his arrest were expunged. But David's vindication came at a tremendous personal cost. The 8 months in federal custody had taken a toll on his health, and the stress had strained his family relationships. Lisa, now in her senior year of high school, had struggled with depression and anxiety after watching her father branded as a traitor. Patricia had been forced to sell their house to pay legal fees, and even with David's exoneration, they faced years of financial recovery. The family that had once enjoyed a comfortable middle-class lifestyle now found themselves starting over from scratch. David returned to work, but he was a changed man. The naive trust he had once placed in the system had been replaced by a harder wisdom about how power really worked in Washington. He continued his investigations with renewed purpose, knowing that there were other Franklin Webbs out there, other conspiracies waiting to be exposed. 6 months after his exoneration, David received an unexpected visitor at his office. Agent Lisa Kim, the CIA polygraph examiner who had testified on his behalf, stopped by to check on how he was doing. "I wanted you to know," she told David, "that your case has led to major changes in how we handle security investigations. No one should have to go through what you experienced." David nodded, grateful for her words but still scarred by his experience. "I just hope it prevents someone else from being framed." "It will," Agent Kim assured him. "Your case is now taught at the FBI Academy as an example of how investigations can be corrupted by outside interests. You've made the system stronger." As Agent Kim left his office, David reflected on the strange irony of his situation. His security clearance, the very thing that had made him valuable as a scapegoat, had ultimately saved him. The rigorous background checks and polygraph examinations that were designed to protect national security had protected him from those who would abuse the system. David's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting whistleblowers. But it was also a story about the resilience of truth and the power of one person's determination to do the right thing, even when the cost seemed unbearable. Years later, when people asked David if he regretted investigating Phoenix Defense Corporation, knowing what it had cost him and his family, his answer was always the same. "I took an oath to serve my country," he would say. That oath didn't come with an expiration date or an exception clause for when things got difficult. "I would do it again tomorrow." And he meant every word.